Okay, this is the audio review of Chapter 1, The New Jim Crow, Rebirth of the Caste. So remember, in this chapter, she's setting up her overall argument for the entire book. So we're going to go over it kind of briefly, since we're going to go over those specific arguments much more in depth in the chapters that follow, right? So anyway, to start off, she talks about the Emancipation Proclamation, right? That W.E.B. Du Bois, featured here in the bottom, argued that former slaves had this brief moment in the sun before they returned to a status akin to slavery, right? So that emancipation was literally called Jubilee, right? The idea that racism was over, right? But the problem that she talks about is the adaptability of racism. So again, when we talk about this, there needs to be a disclaimer before we jump into all this fun stuff, which is that we are critiquing systems, not individuals, right? The systems itself are what are under scrutiny. So we're going to talk about the system of the criminal justice system, the system of policing, right? All of these kind of situations to understand the larger social caste systems that she calls these racial caste systems, right? So I feel like it's important to say that because sometimes people get the two conflated together. Like, for instance, if you critique masculinity, people think you're critiquing men, which again makes kind of no sense. Because if I say, like, if I'm critiquing femininity, no one thinks I'm criticizing women, right? So if I say, hey, women shouldn't be held to unrealistic body standards, or they shouldn't have to wear, makeup if they don't feel like it, right? Or something like that. That doesn't mean that then I hate women and I'm criticizing all women, right? So why is it when we say, that we have a toxic masculinity in our culture that really problematizes the situation of masculinity and makes it very violent and often, conflict, then somehow that's like, oh, you're criticizing men, right? But of course, that's not the way that this works. We're criticizing systems, not individuals. We're criticizing the structural forces, right? Not the people. So if we talk about the systems of policing, we're not going to talk about the individual police officers as much as we're talking about the system itself that gives rise to structural inequalities, right? So anyway, blah, 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 disclaimer. All right, let's jump in. So she argues that the fact that African Americans have experienced great success in recent years does not mean that something akin to a racial caste system no longer exists. So this means that, and we'll talk about this more in depth later, but we tend to tokenize individuals like Oprah or Obama and say, look, they made it, so there's not a racial division or hierarchy in society anymore. But the reality is racism is adaptable. So the ideas of race and racial groups change over time as society changes, right? We talked about this when we talked about social construction, right? How the culture constructs what kind of messages and images and value systems that we have, right? So while institutions that gave birth to racism like slavery are gone, right? She argues that, slavery eventually went away, but racial ideology was preserved and racism didn't die with slavery, right? So anyway, we kind of have to go back into the past and talk about the historical understandings before we can understand the connections to today. And like I said before, this is an overview of the entire book in chapter 1, so we're going to just kind of take it in bits and pieces and we'll get to the details as we go through the book later on. Okay, so she talks about how the concept of race itself is a very recent social development, meaning that it's something that came about due largely to European colonialism. So the idea of race itself really emerged to justify the extermination of indigenous groups, right? By calling them savages and saying that they somehow, didn't know how to manage or tend the land, which is, preposterous because people lived here for thousands of years before European colonization, right? Also, it was used, race in the European colonialism context was used to justify the system of slavery, right? To say that it's okay to enslave people because they're not really people, right? So the same kind of thing of exterminating indigenous peoples because you say they're not really people, they're savages, right? Or in this context, they're not really people, they're slaves. Then you can basically uphold a Western ideology of freedom and liberty while still literally causing genocides and forced relocations, as well as putting people in bondage and chains, right? So basically, she talks about that this was a strategy for maintaining dominance, meaning in an effort to protect the superior status and economic position of, the planting groups, that the planners really shifted their strategy for maintaining dominance. So there was this thing called the Bacon Rebellion, right, where indentured white and black servants as well as slaves banded together and rose up against the white elite. And so this frightened the elite class. And they put down the rebellion with force, like they hung everyone, right, that rebelled. So, but hanging the people wasn't enough. They realized they needed to break up biracial alliances. So they largely did that by really trying to force the issue. And so as a result, what happens is this racial bribe, right? And so I'm going to embed the video for you as well, but on Canvas. But so I really hope that you take a moment right now to stop what I'm talking about and watch this video in a second here. So really what he's talking about with the racial bribe is giving small rights and status to poor white people to effectively divide and conquer the coalitions between poor whites and poor people of color. So these measures really eliminated the risk of future alliances because they gave certain privileges and statuses to white Americans. And so this is why, when we talk about white privilege, this is the kind of nexus or the birth, the genesis of white privilege, right? Comes from this racial bribe. And so I like to use this clip because he really outlines how these things were developed in the colonies, but then he really talks about how that still is true today. So please just click on the page that has these videos embedded, watch the video real quick, and then come on back to finish up what it is I'm yammering about. All right, so moving on. She basically talks about how the degraded status of Africans was justified on the grounds that Black people, just like Native Americans at the time, were considered an inferior race, perhaps more lacking in intelligence and admirable human qualities. So the notion of white supremacy just rationalized that hatred, that power dynamic, the kind of fear maligning, right? And so it rationalized enslavement of Africans. And even as whites were forming a nation based on ideals of equality, liberty, and justice for all, they didn't understand just how incredibly, painfully, not ironic, I guess, but just cruel and twisted a notion of liberty and equality is in a nation where liberty and equality only means white male property owners to be able to have any of that status or power. So even when you talk about all men are created equal, it didn't actually extend to all men. It didn't extend to men of color. It didn't extend to poor white men, or just anyone that didn't own land. And of course, as women were legally restricted in most colonies from owning any property, obviously didn't extend to women. I mean, it says all men are created. So anyway, we know that the nation itself is kind of created with these mythical notions of, fairness and liberty and equality, but ultimately that's not actually what was happening in the time period in America, right? So the significance of race in defining the basic structure of American society cannot be overtold, meaning it's impossible to overstate the influence. The structure and the content of the original Constitution itself was largely based on the effort to preserve a racial caste system of slavery, right? So while at the same time they were affording political and economic rights to white people, especially property-owning whites, they were finding ways to ensconce in the law a way to legally have different statuses for different types of people. So federalism is the division of power between the states and the federal government. So this was the device employed to protect the institution of slavery, right, and the political power of slave-owning states, right? As we'll talk about more in depth later, this idea, I'm sure you've all heard of like the 3/5 compromise or things of this nature, the idea that a person of color was considered 3/5 a person. But it wasn't because they actually got to vote. The idea was that this shifted power to the planting class, to the elites in the South, because let's say you own a plantation and you have all of these people exploitively working for you, right? Then basically if you're able to say that you are one person, but you have 3/5, to count for all of these other people that are enslaved to you, then that just means that you have more representatives in the House, right? So this is, again, why population totals matter, why the census matters, things like that, because we want to have an accurate count of people so that we know what kind of amount of representation is needed in the halls of power. So this was just a way to kind of trick the system itself to make sure that more power was going to the slave-owning states, right? Because they got to count all these people as 3/5 a person that didn't actually get to vote themselves, that didn't actually get the benefits of the resources that were allocated financially and socially to those states, right? So this is just one example of the ways that racism itself has been built into the structure of our government. All right, so slavery ends, right? But the notion of white supremacy proved much more durable than the institution itself of slavery. So white supremacy became a sort of religion, especially in the South, but really across all of the United States. Right? So whites were considered inherently superior, and that's how the law reflected that, the culture reflected that, the value systems all reflected that. So Africans were seen as beasts, and many argued that slavery was actually good for Africans, right? Which kind of reconciled the tensions between slavery and the ideals of democracy, right? Because how hypocritical can you be to say we believe in freedom, but then literally enslave people, right? So what's interesting is that, the notions of these things, again, justify the unequal treatment of people. So racial division was a consequence, not a precondition of slavery, but once it was instituted, it became detached from its initial function, and so it acquired its own social potency. So the idea of race lived on. The end of slavery brought a dilemma for white Southern society. Without slavery, there was no formal mechanism to maintain racial hierarchy and prevent amalgamation. Not just that, but we'll talk about in a minute, the economy had a lot to do with this too. That there has always been an economic motive to racial oppression, as much as there's a, racial motive to some economic oppression. So basically, the racial division, there was this belief that a new system of racial control was essential, right? Because there was rumors of those insurrections, or all these frightened white elites thought that people were going to rise up, right? And the stereotypes, the current ones that we have about Black men being aggressive or unruly predators, can actually be traced to this period, the Reconstruction era, right after slavery, right? That they created all of these kind of notions to justify the horrible unequal treatment, the rounds of torture and executions through lynchings, all of that stuff that we'll be talking about much more in depth later. So basically, there was this white fear that an angry mass of Black men might rise up and attack them, or as another racialized stereotype and trope that was created in this era, this fear that Black men would be raping white women, right? Which is something that we've seen basically throughout that time period to this day as a kind of weird dog whistle, racist trope, right? So anyway, it is interesting to see how, the economy has a lot to do with this as well, because it was devastated at the end of slavery, right? And of course, there was the damage of the Civil War itself, but the fact that there were literally, you go from a situation where you're making money because you're paying someone zero to a situation where now you're not making money, right? So there was an economic imperative to creating a new racial caste system that would make sure that people of color didn't have the same economic opportunities. Right? So most white people believe that Blacks in the South lacked proper motivation to work, which prompted the South to make the Black Codes. So just side note, I know you're probably thinking, wait, what? How could a country that, not even 15 years earlier said that Africans were inherently work animals, that were not people, that therefore worked so much stronger and better than whites, how could they then within 10 years flip that script around to say, oh, they're just lazy shiftabouts and they don't want to work, you got to make them work, right? Why? Because it's all BS, right? The ideology is just a justification for the inequality. It's never based on real fact or logic, just like the inequalities today. The logic of them are not based on fact or logic. It's just a way to excuse away inequality, right? So the Black Codes were created, which we'll talk about a little bit more. These were laws that were developed to make life difficult for recently freed men. Another version of which were the Convict laws, which were used as a way to legitimize punishment for minorities. So we'll talk about this much more in depth in a minute. So the Reconstruction era, during this time, a lot of legislation was passed to protect the rights of African Americans. So the 13th Amendment was the first one. This abolished slavery. And there was the Civil Rights Act of 1886, which gave full citizenship to African Americans. There was also the 14th Amendment, right, which stopped states from denying citizens due process and equal protection under the law, as well as the 15th Amendment that said that the right to vote should not be denied on account of race. And so this is another part of that too, is the Ku Klux Klan Acts, which basically made interfering with voting a federal crime, as that was commonly a procedure that the KKK used to terrorize Black communities so that they didn't have any voting representation even after they gained voting rights, right? So they made the violent infringements of civil rights a crime and interfering with federal voting a crime. So there was also expansion to this thing called the Freedmen's Bureau, which was basically an agency that provided food, clothing, fuel, and other forms of assistance to destitute former slaves, right? Because obviously they needed a lot of help coming out of this system of inequality. So unfortunately, a lot of these laws were really during this era proving largely symbolic, right? Absence from the 15th Amendment was language that prohibited states from imposing some sort of qualifications on voting, right? Whether it was educational, the kind of poll, taxes, literacy tests, things like that, right? Whether it was residential or just financial. So also the threat of violence was often deterred a lot of people from pressing legitimate claims of voter suppression or other, civil rights infringements, largely because the high cost of court proceedings and the fact that people were truly not really believed because they had very little status in society. So then moving on, we get to the birth of Jim Crow. And part of this built out of the Black Codes that we'll talk more in depth about later, but really just kind of to give you a little understanding of it. Some of these laws were connected to like the vagrancy laws and other laws. Basically, some activities were so vague, they were described as like mischief. Oh, you were creating mischief, like you're Dennis the Menace or something. And so they were enforced vigorously against African Americans, right? So something like insulting gesture could be a crime that you were then imprisoned for. And so during this time, just side note, there was a backlash to the perceived gains of the Reconstruction era. This led to a huge resurgence of the KKK, which fought this terrorist campaign, including, because they were obviously against Reconstruction. So any governments or local leaders that supported Reconstruction efforts or tried to help African Americans that had been freed from slavery were targeted literally with bombings, lynchings, mob violence, right? This is domestic terrorism. So the campaign was highly successful and resulted in a lack of government enforcement of civil rights legislation, and they slashed funding for the Freedmen's Bureau, right? Largely because they didn't want to be blown up by the KKK, right? So unfortunately, domestic terrorism really had a huge impact on what was actually done in this era. So convict leasing is kind of a byproduct or an outgrowth of the Black Codes. Black Codes being things like, you can't be in a town after sundown or something like that. Meaning, let's say you're working in that area and you're walking home, vagrancy. Look, you're not working right this moment, so you're a vagrant. Therefore, that's illegal. Therefore, we can incarcerate you, right? And so convict leasing was this really interesting situation where basically it was a way to kind of bridge the gap between slavery and creating almost a new form of slavery, right? Which happened through convict leasing. So this is where prisoners were contracted out as laborers, right? So this is a system where tens of thousands of African Americans were arbitrarily arrested for stuff like, you looked at someone weird, you made a gesture, right? Things that are not actual crimes, but were created to be crimes so that they could obviously enforce them vigorously against African Americans. And then they were hit with incredibly high court costs, right? So the only way you could pay off the court cost was through forced labor, meaning going back into slave-like conditions. So the interest in the health of convicts was actually worse than under slavery, because think about it this way, right? If you own someone, right, this economic exploitation of literally owning somebody, then as much as, obviously people treated slaves incredible cruelty to control and, manipulate their lives, there was still an imperative to keep people alive because there was an economic unit in that. Under convict leasing, there was none, meaning you could just arbitrarily arrest hundreds of people the next day, and therefore it doesn't matter if you let them die. So people were literally dying in fields because they were just not being given water, working 16 hours in the sun. And so this was, creating its own nation's first prison boom at that time, right? The convict population grew 10 times faster than the overall population. And this was largely because convicts themselves had no meaningful legal rights. They were literally slaves of the state. So slavery maintained an appropriate sentence or punishment for a crime. So to understand the history of this stuff, we also have to understand the politics of this era, right? So during this time period, there were different philosophies about the status and role of African Americans in American society, right? So the liberal philosophy of racial relations really emphasized the stigma of segregating people, the hypocrisy of government that celebrates freedom and equality yet denies both on accounts of race. And while the conservative philosophy at the time attracted the most support, This blamed liberals for pushing blacks ahead of their quote-unquote proper station in life, meaning subordination, exploitation, and placing them in positions they were, quote, unprepared to fill. Right? It couldn't be the fact that you didn't provide any education or literacy. That couldn't be why people are unprepared. It has to be because of some biological inherency, right? While the radical philosophy was predicated on a searing critique of large corporations, particularly the railroads and the wealthy elite in the North and South, so these radicals later formed what was called the Populist Party, and viewed the privileged class as conspiring to keep poor whites and blacks locked into a subordinate political and economic position. So populists made strides towards racial integration, and which was, obviously a symbol of their commitment to class-based unity. Right? So the movement was very successful and had a lot of political victories, but there was also a conservative backlash to this that raised the cry of white supremacy. And so resorting to the tactics they had employed for their quest for redemption, this includes, the KKK jumping in with fraud, intimidation, bribery, terror, and as a result, segregation laws were proposed as part of a deliberate effort to drive a wedge between poor whites and African Americans. So these discriminatory barriers were designed to encourage lower-class whites to retain a sense of superiority over blacks. This made it far less likely that they're going to sustain interracial political alliances that are aimed at toppling the white elites, which is another racial bribe. Right, like in the video. So ultimately, the populists caved and they dropped their aim of integration, and they themselves also supported segregation, a total condemnation of African Americans. So by the turn of the century, every state in the South had laws on the books that disenfranchised blacks and discriminated against them in virtually every sphere of life, right? Lending sanction to a racial ostracism that extended to schools, churches, housing, jobs, restrooms, hotels, restaurants, hospitals, orphanages, prisons, funeral homes, morgues, even cemeteries. So Brown versus Board of Education is largely seen as the beginning of the end of Jim Crow. Although other laws had chipped away at the separate but equal, this case really challenged the Southern legal environment. The consensus that Jim Crow was ending came from the increased political power of blacks due to migration to the North and growing membership and influence of groups like the NAACP. And really, the influence of World War II, because a racial caste system proved pretty embarrassing and damaging to the credibility of the U.S. as the leader of the free world, right? Meaning, if you're going in to liberate Europe from the Nazis, right, then you have to really call into account, why are we doing eugenics in our own country? Why are we having racially segregated units fight that war, right? Super hypocritical. So that also kind of affected the notions of it in that time period. So there was a mood of outrage and defiance similar to the reaction to the Emancipation Proclamation and Reconstruction after the Civil War. There was a vicious backlash to desegregation and a fresh wave of terror that was hurled at those who supported dismantling Jim Crow, following the Brown and the Brown decision and others. And so the KKK at the time reasserted itself as a powerful terrorist organization that committed, killings, bombings of black homes and churches, castrating people, lynchings. And so NAACP leaders were also beaten, whipped, pistol whipped, shot, targeted, right? So in the absence of massive grassroots movement directly challenging the racial caste system, Jim Crow might be alive and well today. But the civil rights movement maintained pressure on international political environment, with civil rights leaders, activists, and progressive clergy staging boycotts, marches, sit-ins, really protesting the system of Jim Crow. So they endured fire hoses, police dogs, bombings, and beatings by white mobs and the police. But what culminated was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 formally dismantled the Jim Crow system of discrimination in public accommodations, employment, voting, education, and federally financed activities. But the Voting Rights Act of 1965 made illegal discriminatory barriers to voting, such as literacy tests or poll taxes, and mandated a federal review of all new voting regulations so that it would be possible to determine whether their use would perpetuate voting discrimination. Something we'll talk about later when we talk about how this was repealed in, I think it was 2010, 2011, by a ruling in the Supreme Court that said it's no longer necessary as a provision. And then what we saw was within 2 years of that ruling, a lot of states enacted voter ID laws that some argue suppressed the vote. So we'll kind of connect back to this argument later on. So another issue during this time was the Poor People's Campaign, right? So the goals of the civil rights movement shifted past race to the issues of poverty. So while some reforms had taken place, African Americans still found themselves locked in poverty. So the shift in focus aligned the movement with key goals of poor and working class whites. And MLK argued that the genuine equality that we need in society demands a radical restructuring of society, one that would address the needs of Black and white poor people throughout the country. So conservative whites saw this as a challenge, and they started grasping for a new racial order, one that would sound and appear race neutral. And the seeds of the new system were being sown before the end of the civil rights movement. Right? And so what we got from that, what she calls our modern racial caste system, is the birth of mass incarceration. So what emerged was the law and order rhetoric. This was used as an attempt to rally people who were mad about desegregation and the gains of the civil rights movement. So this was linked with opposition to civil rights legislation. So the changes in the laws were characterized as rewarding lawbreakers, because technically, if you're doing a march, kind of civil disobedience thing, like let's say Rosa Parks, right? Not moving from her seat, right? That's considered being a lawbreaker, right? That's considered, so some people argued that changing the law is just rewarding people for breaking the law. So for more than a decade, conservatives systematically linked opposition of civil rights with what they called law and order rhetoric, right? With some segregationists arguing that integration causes crime. And this was spurred on by the media, as it often is, right? As a lot of the controlling images for society come through our media. So racial imagery was also associated with riots, meaning some cities had race riots and other uprisings after the assassination of MLK and other high-profile either, murders of Black leaders or high-profile police brutality situations. So these images were used over and over as a justification for those efforts, linking criminality and race, and not ever really talking about, well, why are people out in the street in the first place? Oh, well, because someone was killed in their bed while they were laying next to their, Fred Hampton, while he was laying next to his pregnant wife, right? At 21, 22 years old? But it was like, no, they're just criminals. Look at them out in the street. And you're like, but it's a reaction to something, right? So originally, little effort was made to disguise the racial motivations behind the law and order rhetoric. But later, segregationists distanced themselves from this in an explicitly racist agenda. As you'll see documented in the film 13th, we'll discuss later in the class, there's actually literally quotes from these people, these political strategists, that'll tell you more than I can say. So, they developed a racially sanitized rhetoric of cracking down on crime, which proved highly effective in appealing to poor and working class whites. And so this kind of created a party alignment shift, right? During this time, there was a shift of political party affiliation. At the time, it was more about region, meaning the South was pretty much Democrat. But the rhetoric appealing to white anger and fear and racism, Black insurrection, poor whites just flooded into the Republican Party as the Democrats signed civil rights legislation, right? After Kennedy was killed, that was kind of pushed through pretty quickly by LBJ. And, that was a huge kind of blow to poor white Southerners that had learned from years and years and years of political propaganda to blame people of color for their problems. It's not huge corporations. It's not wealthy elites. That's not the problem. It's the people that are poorer than you. And we still see this same rhetoric today when it comes to immigrant communities. We say, oh, it's the immigrants taking the jobs. It's not the fact that capitalism creates a metric where it benefits the capitalist to pay you less. It's not Jeff Bezos making, billions and billions and billions of dollars a year. It's this immigrant that's to blame, right? So really, it's really interesting to see how power maintains itself by blaming all these other things, by dividing coalitions, because if we all realize how much we're being screwed by that elite class, we could collectivize together and do something about it, right? So anyway, the Southern strategy was something that was crafted by Nixon. Hint, You've experienced it in your own lifetime in the 2016 election from Donald Trump, right? The Southern strategy was created by the Nixon campaign. It was basically trying to appeal to angry, poor, racist white people from the South that are a large voting bloc by using coded language and appealing to their concerns without obvious bias. So meaning you say things like thug, right? Hoodlum, or this was used very strategically by the Reagan campaign using the term welfare queen, right? Which we'll discuss later. So, it all came down to conservatives and liberals' views of the causes of poverty, right? So conservatives at that time argued that the causes in the surge in poverty, especially in Black communities, wasn't structural factors. It wasn't the fact that people were, systematically segregated and kept out of legitimate work opportunities, kept out of education or anything like that, right? It wasn't structural factors. The conservatives argued it was actually a problem with Black culture, which is still an argument used today by the right wing, right? Where they say Black people themselves are just lazy, they're unskilled, they're welfare cheats, and therefore that's why they're poor, right? It has nothing to do with the failing schools, the lack of, job opportunities, all those kind of things. It just is like a whole group of people just deciding not to do anything, right? So liberals, though, insisted that social reforms like civil rights legislation and a war on poverty could get to the root causes of criminal behavior, meaning that, as we've talked about through this class, people often are motivated to committing crimes in order to, provide for their families or protect themselves in situations where legitimate opportunities wane, right? So they stressed that social conditions that generate crime should be addressed and therefore there would be less crime, right? So it's interesting to see how the politics of the time also affect the way that we understand and interpret what we're seeing or the prejudices and really what laws and reforms are enacted. So conservatives repeatedly raised the issue of welfare, and during this period, Nixon announced what was called a war on drugs. So the not so subtle messages of these campaigns to working class white people was, hey, your tax dollars are going to support special programs for Black people. And the rhetoric is, they don't deserve them, not like you do, right? So it's interesting that this was all about trying to put pressure on people that the poor whites themselves are also feeling pressure because of the exact same capitalistic forces. But instead of seeing kind of brotherhood in other people being exploited, because of that racial bribe, because of that white supremacy, there was this inherent understanding of, no, you are superior, therefore you should have better opportunities, right? And so a lot of this comes down to should have, or, who should be this or that. A lot of that is basically a function of racial prejudice. So the colorblind rhetoric was used as plausible deniability. So the colorblind rhetoric on crime, on welfare, on taxes, and states' rights was understood by white and Black voters as having racial dimensions, like you'll see in 13th, the clip where he says, oh, when now we say states' rights, we don't use the N-word anymore. And you're like, yeah, because it's a nice way. When you say states' rights, it's just like what Tim Wise was saying in the video clip, states' rights to maintain and own slavery. That was kind of the whole notion of the Civil War. And so a lot of these things, the way that it's coded when they say tax reform, right, when they say welfare reform, what that really means is, see, welfare was not considered controversial until the Civil Rights era when people of color actually started receiving welfare. There were a lot of restrictions to welfare before that often did not include more marginal people. Right? Meaning welfare has been and always has been in the United States a predominantly white thing, right? The majority of the people on welfare have often been people in rural white areas. So the notion that the people that are cheating welfare just kind of laying at home doing nothing, or just all these, shifty people of color, was really just used as a justification to cut those programs that benefit poor people of color, that could actually help them with social mobility, right? But the idea was, it kind of makes it difficult because when you use words like states' rights or hoodlums, thugs, things like that, but you don't actually say the N-word, it forces liberals into a position of arguing that something is racist, but it's hard to prove that it's racist because there's not any explicitly racist language involved. So this was why crime and welfare were major themes of Reagan's campaign rhetoric. So welfare queen itself became a term that was commonly used in politics and mainstream media to denote a supposed population of lazy, greedy black ghetto mothers. And so this rhetoric proved very successful for Reagan, right? And what's really kind of side note fascinating about the welfare queen rhetoric is the whole thing was supposed to be supposedly thousands, if not millions, of African American women, when actually it was one woman. Literally one woman is the person that they were pointing out. This one woman, I mean, yes, she did cheat welfare. She had like several fake names that she used to defraud the system. I'm going to put up the link to more information in your additional resources, so if you want to learn more about it. But it's pretty fascinating that it was literally based on one woman, and I think more notable than her scamming welfare is that she murdered a person. But that's not what we hear about, right? We hear about this idea that somehow one person being a criminal means that the entire community is suspect to being a criminal, right? And so again, Reagan got kind of lucky with, his action on the war on drugs because of the emergence of crack cocaine, or some people argue it wasn't luck at all. But anyway, this gave fuel to the fire of racially coded legislation because there was an idea that somehow crack cocaine was a drug used by people of color when it was really something that was used pretty evenly across racial groups. So another big problem from this, and again, we're going to talk about all of these other things much more in depth. So if right now you're like, what the hell is she talking about? Don't worry, we'll get through it again later on in depth. Was the impact of globalization and deindustrialization. So globalization, again, is just creating a system where goods and services are produced and distributed all around the world, right? So that instead of just competing within a nation for its labor market, you're now competing with other countries around the world. So this means that you can just move a factory from this country to another country and pay people less money, and you make more money as a result, right? So globalization kind of factors what we call a race to the bottom in this kind of capitalistic notion that the less you can pay people, the better. So this is why we see sweatshop conditions today where people are paid less than 30 cents an hour working, 16 to 18-hour days, 7 days a week, because it's better for capitalism, right? Not because it's better for the human condition at all. And deindustrialization just means moving the industries that used to support the inner city somewhere else. So we talked about this with the theory of concentric circles and how most areas in the inner city of most, industrialized areas had factories, which was what drew people there in the first place. But deindustrialization was having enough technology through globalization to be able to move whole things, like let's say car industry, completely out of Detroit, right? And then what replaced it? Oh, all of these great jobs. Nothing replaced it, right? So it creates this vacuum where globalization basically makes someone else's labor, someone else in some other country look a lot more favorable than yours. And then they can pay them less, so they move the entire industry there. But when that's the only thing supporting the area, right? Like we talked about with Elijah Anderson's father, the guy who wrote Code of the Street that you read for this class. His father moved to Philadelphia with a 4th grade education, was able to get a job in a Studebaker factory, making the equivalent of what in today's money would be about $55,000 a year, right? Most people now in labor can't say they're making on average $55,000 a year. And he wasn't they weren't giving him the money away. He was pulling, engine blocks out of a furnace. But the idea was you could work hard, you could actually have some sort of social mobility for your family and opportunities for your children, right? But that mechanism died when the industries left through deindustrialization, because that factory labor that provided $55,000 a year disappeared. So they could pay someone $20,000 a year somewhere else. And then 5 years later, $10,000 a year somewhere else, or 5 years later, $5,000 a year somewhere else, so that they can keep making money. But ultimately, what it left was this wake and devastation in inner city communities that had no other labor. It's not like, oh, I'll just go to college instead and get those high-paid jobs, right? Because those were just not accessible. And often, itself, education was not only inaccessible, but generational inequality from lack of education in the past led to situations in the 60s and 70s as well. So this is part of the reason why the crack epidemic hit like it did, because there was already destabilized communities that were left because of deindustrialization, meaning jobs are gone, the drug market comes in and fills in the gap. So, for example, she cites a study in the chapter that talks about how in 1970, 70% of all blacks working in the metropolitan area had blue-collar jobs, right? Something akin to, being able to somewhat support the family, right? Somewhat, lower middle class lifestyle. By 1987, from 1970, this plummeted to only 28%. So meaning 70% of people employed, 1970. By 1987, 28%, less than 30%. And with less people having access to cars and the new manufacturing moving to more wealthy suburban areas, this also dropped the percentage of people to 18% of people living in, these kind of more ghettoized areas, right? So this is huge, because this meant that the decline itself in legitimate opportunities among inner city residents increased incentives to sell drugs, because joblessness and crack swept inner cities at the same time, when there's this backlash against civil rights manifesting through the war on drugs. And so the war on drugs proved very popular among key white voters. Researchers found that racial attitudes, not crime rates or likelihood of victimization, are an important determinant of white support for these kind of get tough on crime or anti-welfare measures. And they're often cloaked in a race-neutral language, meaning they offer those opposed to racial reform opportunities to express their hostility towards blacks and black progress without being called racist. So part of this example of this they give is the Willie Horton ad, very famously done, that, I included the ad here. I'm going to embed it in that page for you on Canvas as well. So I want you to watch it just to kind of get an idea of what kind of racialized framing was happening. Some people argue it wasn't racialized at all. It was just about a guy committing a crime. But it basically turned around the entire election at that time. Dukakis was leading going into the primaries. But then this ad ran over and over and over with millions of dollars in airwave funding. And then all of a sudden, Dukakis dropped. Support for Dukakis dropped dramatically, and a lot of more people supported George H.W. Bush, because they basically said, oh, well, he's going to be tough on crime, right? And that started swaying elections, being tough on crime. So just take a second here, watch this clip, and come on back. All right, so progressives were concerned about racial justice, but they were mostly silent about the war on drugs. They spent a lot of their energy focused on civil rights legislation and protecting or defending affirmative action policies. So in the Clinton era, he was charged on the campaign trail with not being tough on crime. So what he did was he hardened his efforts and even stopped campaigning to go home and oversee the execution of a mentally retarded black man, right? Saying that that after that, no one can call him soft on crime, because that was basically a way that Republicans were winning elections at the time, was saying, hey, you got to support Republican because we're tough on crime. So what happened was the Clinton administration actually took a huge step to the right, pulled themselves into kind of more Republican ideology and said, no, we're going to be tough on crime. Right? So, and this is, again, the man that he saw the execution of, let me just explain it this way. During his last meal, the man that was being executed, when he was eating his dessert, he asked the guard to save his dessert for tomorrow so he could finish eating it tomorrow. Does that sound like a man that understands what execution is, or that he's going to die that day? No. But anyway, so he also pioneered the federal policy of 3 strikes you're out. He passed this bill that created dozens of new federal capital crimes, mandated life sentences for some three-time offenders, and authorized more than $16 billion, which was a lot in the 90s, for state prison grants and expansion of state and local police forces. Part of this came out of this was the Personal Responsibility Work Reconciliation Act, which basically ended welfare as we know it, or as we knew it. You never knew it because you were not born at that point, and replaced it with Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which is called TAMF, which imposes a 5-year lifetime on welfare assistance, a lifetime ban for anyone convicted of a felony drug offense, including simple possession of marijuana. So what does this do? This basically effectively takes away any social support system for people that are struggling. And we'll talk much more about this in depth as well later. So the law and order perspective, first introduced during the peak of the civil rights movement by rabid segregationists, became hegemonic 2 decades later. Remember, hegemony just meaning the dominant system, the kind of accepted dominant view, right? Is the hegemony. So over 2 million people found themselves behind bars during this era. and millions more under correctional control. So Alexander argues that this put people into a situation that's very similar to Jim Crow, because segregation is legal once you have a felony status, right? So it's legal to segregate you in housing. You can't get the same opportunities in employment. Access to education or grants for, financial aid are restricted. And, people also are denied the vote, meaning there's only 2 states in the US that allow you to vote if you're a convicted felon. Almost all states have either a 7 to 11 year ban that you can't vote, and some don't re-enfranchise you ever. You can never vote again. So 90% of those admitted for drug offenses during this time period were Black or Latino, but the system itself was explained as race neutral. So people didn't see it as inherently unequal in the way that policing and the court systems themselves were obviously problematically racializing the issue. So we're going to talk much more about all of these specific arguments that she makes, and she's going to break down each one with a lot of specific examples in court cases to show how the structure of the system has maintained this inequality to this day.